Target Australia, Japanese submarine attacks on Sydney and Newcastle, written and narrated by Mark Felton. This is an audio-only episode for War Stories with Mark Felton. Episode 1. Japan knew little of Australia when she started her war with the United States and the British Empire. The Japanese rapidly conquered vast stretches of Southeast Asia and the Pacific, perhaps beyond even their own expectations, and before long Australia was virtually on the southern front line of the new Japanese Empire. Australia was an important member of the British Commonwealth, and she had immediately joined Britain in declaring war against Germany in September 1939, and then Italy and Japan as each new foe appeared, and the war in Europe spread to the entire globe. The Imperial Japanese Navy saw that Australia held the potential to become a vast base and staging area for Anglo-American armies that could directly threaten the Japanese possessions in Southeast Asia. On the 10th of January 1942, the Imperial General Headquarters Government Liaison Conference in Tokyo concluded in its report with two important points of policy to be applied to the threat posed by Australia. Firstly, the Japanese Navy would have to isolate Australia by cutting her lines of communication with India, Britain, and the United States. Such a confinement would require Japanese submarines to actively interdict the seaways used by Australia to communicate and trade with the rest of the world. A serious undertaking when one considers the size of the Australian continent and the small submarine force available to the Japanese. Secondly, the Navy would have to seal Australia off from the other Allied powers and prevent troops and ships from making it to Australia in the first place. The Japanese planned 3 actions in accordance with their outlined general plans concerning Australia, utilizing both air and sea power. Firstly, air attacks were to be directed against the closest large Australian city that could be reached by Japanese planes, Darwin. Secondly, air and ground attacks would be launched against Port Moresby in New Guinea. And thirdly, midget submarine attacks were to be launched against the important Allied naval base in Sydney Harbour. Japanese submarines would also support this operation by conducting shore bombardments and the interdiction of coastal merchant ships. However, before the Japanese launched the daring midget submarine raid into Sydney Harbour, submarine-borne Japanese spotter planes took to the skies over Australia, searching for enticing targets for the fleet. Kwajalein in the recently captured Marshall Islands had become the base for the Japanese 6th Fleet, the Imperial Navy's submarine force. Vice Admiral Mitsumi Shimizu, based aboard the flagship Katori, a light cruiser, commanded the 6th Fleet. The fleet was subdivided into 6 squadrons, each under the command of a rear admiral. Each submarine squadron consisted of several submarine divisions, totaling 21 in all. In each submarine squadron, a light cruiser acted as a flagship, and each submarine division normally contained 3 or 4 submarines, a division being commanded by a captain. The I-25, which was to be engaged against the American mainland as well as Australasia, belonged to the 1st Submarine Squadron, along with the fleet boats I-9, 15, 17, 19, and 23, and RO-61 and RO-62. On the 8th of February 1942, a week after sustaining superficial damage in an American carrier plane strafing attack on the 6th Fleet anchorage, the I-25 departed on her second war patrol. Admiral Shimizu ordered Lieutenant Commander Tagami to take his boat to the east coasts of Australia and New Zealand, and using the Yokosuka E-14Y-1 floatplane carried aboard, to launch a series of reconnaissance missions over important Allied naval bases and commercial shipping centres, such as Sydney and Melbourne, gathering intelligence for future Japanese attacks in the Antipodes. Conventional submarine hunting was not prohibited on this mission, and Tagami struck on the 14th of February close to the northeast coast of Australia, sinking the 5,014-ton British freighter Coldbrook with torpedoes. One of the main civil defence problems confronting the officials responsible for the defence of Sydney was a marked unwillingness of many of the inhabitants of the city to take air raid precautions seriously. For example, on the 14th of January 1942, an air raid alert and blackout was sounded throughout the city, and this led to 707 persons being discovered flouting the blackout. On the 11th of February, a drill was sounded again, but this time the number of blackout offenders had grown to 822, indicating that all over Sydney lights remained burning fiercely, providing any incoming enemy aircraft with useful navigational and targeting points. As civil defence units attempted to deal with civic disobedience, a very real threat materialised out to sea close to the city. On the night of the 14th of February, the Japanese submarine I-25 quietly motored on the surface in the swell, Commander Tagami and his officers watching searchlights play across the sky above the city, numerous pinpricks of light twinkling in the distance, indicating uncovered windows and unshielded car headlights. Tagami ordered the I-25 to a new position 100 miles south of Sydney, a less conspicuous location where the planned aerial reconnaissance could be launched, hopefully without interference. Arriving at the new location to find the sea pitching and rolling his submarine about, Tagami realized that it would prove impossible to safely launch and recover the Yokosuka floatplane to be piloted by Chief Warrant Officer Nobuo Fujita. Tagami would have to wait for the sea conditions to improve, and in the meantime the I-25 would remain undetected by the Australians. She would only come to the surface in the dead of night to replenish her air supply and charge her batteries. For several days, the I-25 remained hidden beneath the waves during the hours of daylight. Tagami, his executive officer, Lieutenant Tatsuo Tsukudo, and Fujita poring over charts of the city, planning a daring flight over one of the Allies' most important naval bases and commercial ports. By the evening of the 16th of February, the sea had calmed sufficiently to allow Tagami to decide whether to launch Fujita on his reconnaissance mission over Sydney or abort the operation entirely. An hour after dark, the I-25 rose to periscope depth. Tagami completed a full sweep of the horizon and, satisfied that there was nothing out there except calm waters, ordered his XO, Lieutenant Tsukudo, to surface the boat. The conning tower hatch was opened, allowing fresh, cool air into the stale submarine, and the officers and enlisted men scrambled topside to complete a further scan of the horizon with binoculars for any potential threats. The engineering officer was detailed to begin recharging the I-25's batteries, using one of the large diesel engines, and to recharge the compressed air bottles. Both of these tasks were completed by midnight. In the meantime, Tsukudo took charge of the assembly of the E-14Y1 floatplane, a job that normally took an hour to an hour and a half to complete. The timing of the mission was a crucial factor, determining whether Fujita and his observer, Petty Officer Second Class Shoji Okuda, would regain the submarine following their sortie over enemy territory. If Fujita and Okuda were sent off too early, they would return from their mission in the dark, making locating the I-25 virtually impossible with the naked eye. Therefore, Tsukudo's mission plan gave Fujita 1 hour over Sydney, coupled with an hour's flying time to and from the target. Tsukudo decided that the floatplane would begin heading back to the I-25 shortly after sunrise at 6:32 a.m. Although the submarine was vulnerable to attack when sitting on the surface in daylight, it remained the best chance for Fujita to pilot his aircraft back to the submarine and be successfully recovered. The aircraft, in several parts, was carefully removed from the I-25's watertight hangar by a team of 10 mechanics at 3:30 a.m. on the 17th of February. Under Tsukudo's expert supervision, the mechanics assembled the floatplane ready for flight, scheduled to commence in 1 hour. Fujita and Okuda boarded their assembled and fueled floatplane and stared pointedly ahead at the 60 feet of catapult rail welded onto the submarine's deck that would serve as their runway. Commander Tagami turned his submarine into the wind and maintained a steady 18 knots, designed to assist the light floatplane into the air by providing extra lift as the catapult provided rapid acceleration. Once airborne, Fujita cruised the plane at a conservative 90 knots and set course for Sydney Harbour. The Japanese aircraft crossed Botany Bay at about 7,500 feet, then banked to the northwest and crossed Parramatta. Dropping through low clouds to 5,000 feet, Sydney Harbour Bridge loomed out of the gloom below. Whole sections of the harbour, despite repeated warnings concerning enemy air raids, well lit up. In particular, the powerful Macquarie Lighthouse remained operational, as well as the Garden Island Naval Base, including the large graving docks. In the glare of many lights across the harbour, Okuda was able to observe 23 Allied ships moored in the harbour or tied up alongside the docks, and among this number he discerns several large warships and 5 submarines. Fujita and Okuda had seen enough, especially as light was beginning to filter into the sky around them, and their white fuselage and wings, with blood-red Hinomaru Rising Sun roundels painted on them, would soon attract attention from the ground as visibility improved. Although it was almost fully light by the time Fujita banked away towards North Head and the open sea, the Australian authorities had not registered the presence of a Japanese spotter plane over such a sensitive area. Fujita expected at any moment that a hail of anti-aircraft shells would fill the air around his plane, but there was no response from the ground at all. After passing over North Head, Fujita dropped the float plane down to about 150 feet above the surface of the sea, and skimming the waves, he set a course for his rendezvous with the I-25. As Fujita and Okuda flew slowly across the sea, they spotted 2 merchant ships moving down the Australian east coast that would have made juicy targets for Tagami and his submarine, Okuda noting their position and course to pass on to his skipper when they returned. Although Fujita arrived at the designated rendezvous point on time, the I-25 was nowhere to be seen. Fujita was under strict instructions concerning maintaining radio silence, lest the Australians intercepted any Japanese transmissions and sent forces to hunt for the I-25. Fujita need not have worried, for when Okuda attempted to send a short radio message to the I-25, he discovered that the radio was not working properly anyway. Low on fuel, Fujita had one option remaining before landing his plane in the sea: to conduct a limited grid search of the area in the hope of locating the submarine. Running practically on fumes, Fujita suddenly spied the Japanese submarine on the surface. To prevent a blue-on-blue, or so-called friendly fire incident, as the aircraft approached the I-25, Fujita waggled his wings to identify himself to the lookouts on the submarine's conning tower. In reply, they released a yellow flare, indicating the wind direction and requesting that Fujita land. Fujita executed a good landing into the sea and taxied alongside the I-25, where a retractable crane was used to haul the plane aboard for disassembly. Fujita and Okuda immediately briefed Tagami and Tsukudo on their mission, and by 7:30 a.m. the mechanics had successfully stowed the float plane back in its hangar. Tagami ordered the I-25 to proceed south on the surface at 14 knots, as Fujita and Okuda rested below after their challenging mission. After successfully penetrating the airspace above Sydney Harbour and remaining undetected and unchallenged by the Australians, Tagami's next task was to take his submarine to Melbourne and allow Fujita to conduct a similar reconnaissance sortie over the harbour there. Entering the Bass Strait between Victoria and Tasmania on the 18th of February, Tagami would decide to launch Fujita from Cape Wickham, close to Melbourne's Port Phillip Bay. The Melbourne mission would prove to be a close-run thing for Fujita and Okuda. Throughout the morning of the 19th of February, the I-25 travelled on the surface some 200 miles east of the huge island of Tasmania. Then the Japanese submarine turned southeast, taking the I-25 to a position about 80 miles off the Cape Bruni lighthouse. During the afternoon, the submarine battled through a major storm, pushing through heavy seas while heading west below Tasmania. By the following day, the storm had begun to abate, allowing Tagami a moment to conduct his own reconnaissance before launching the float plane on its mission. The I-25 crossed the Bass Strait to Cape Otway, and running at periscope depth 10 miles off the coast, Tagami had a good view of the coastline of southwest Victoria. After making several sweeps of the Australian coast, Tagami ordered the I-25's periscope retracted, and the boat recrossed the Bass Strait to Cape Wickham to prepare for the coming aerial mission. However, the sea conditions were still too choppy to risk launching the delicate floatplane, and in a repeat of the Sydney operation, the I-25 was forced to wait out the bad weather until conditions improved. Once darkness had fallen on the 25th of February, Tagami determined that the sea conditions were now right to send Fujita and Okuda on their way. The I-25 came to the surface and spent an hour navigating through reefs and shoals before reaching a position 10 miles off Cape Wickham. The sea was calm, a light fog partially concealed the submarine and the white aircraft busily being assembled on its huge deck, and Fujita had a good navigational marker in the Cape Wickham lighthouse, whose automated beam projected out to sea, an ideal point when searching for the submarine after completing the reconnaissance of Melbourne. Tagami turned the submarine's bows into the wind and increased the I-25's surface speed to create an updraft to assist the small plane into the air, and in the pre-dawn darkness of the 26th of February, the submarine's crew listened to the aircraft's engine sound fade into the fog as Fujita headed north across the Bass Strait towards Cape Otway. On reaching Otway, Fujita turned northeast and followed the coastline to another blazing lighthouse at Point Lonsdale at the entrance to Port Phillip Bay. Tearing through heavy cloud cover, Fujita took the floatplane north-northeast towards Port Arlington. The heavy cloud cover proved to be a hindrance to Fujita's mission, as it was impossible for him to fix his position. As Fujita flew along the western shore of Port Phillip Bay at 4,500 feet, he decided to rapidly descend and obtain an exact fix on his position before returning to the cover of the clouds. Dropping through the clouds, the floatplane finally broke free at 900 feet, but when Fujita and Okuda pulled back the cockpit canopy and looked below, panic immediately gripped them both. They had emerged directly above a Royal Australian Air Force base. RAAF Leverton was home to a dozen Wirraways. The Wirraway was an armed Australian version of the American Harvard training aircraft, famous for its engine noise, which sounded uncannily like a motorbike. The base was also home to a few of the more potent Lockheed Hudson maritime bombers, each armed with 6 machine guns and some Avro Anson trainers. Australian personnel on the ground spotted the low and slow-flying Yokosuka floatplane, and a pair of aircraft were scrambled to attempt to intercept and shoot down the interloper. The cloud cover, which had proved such a problem for Fujita's navigation, now proved to be his salvation, as he immediately turned away from Leverton and into the clouds. Neither of the Australian aircraft located Fujita, who continued with his mission, though now much more wary of breaking cover on the flight into Melbourne to check his position. Okuda undoubtedly had taken to fingering the trigger on the single rear-facing 7.7mm machine gun, the floatplane's only means of defence, though in the event of an entanglement with an enemy fighter, both men knew the most likely outcome was a foregone conclusion. Although appearing over an Australian airfield had proved alarming, Fujita next emerged from the clouds above Williamstown, close to a battery of 4 anti-aircraft guns. The gunners immediately identified Fujita's aircraft as Japanese, but in the excitement of actually being confronted by the enemy over home territory, the officer commanding the battery decided to telephone headquarters for instructions instead of opening fire immediately. By the time permission had been granted to commence firing, Fujita was gone, heading straight over the city of Melbourne without further challenge from the city's defences. From only 900 feet, Okuda had an unobstructed view of the entire city and surrounding areas, as he eagerly leaned out of the cockpit with his binoculars. Okuda saw central Melbourne and the major dockyards at the mouth of the Yarra River, many houses and facilities showing lights, even though the city was supposed to be under a brownout, with only essential lighting used and everything else switched off or blacked out. Okuda could even discern large flocks of sheep as their aircraft approached the city. Through his binoculars, Okuda counted 19 ships moored in Melbourne harbour, and a light cruiser and 5 destroyers steaming into the harbour in a neat line. Once again, the region's many lighthouses would prove to be excellent navigational beacons for Fujita as he banked his aircraft around the Cape Schanck lighthouse and headed back towards Cape Wickham. After passing over this lighthouse, Fujita located the I-25 without undue difficulty, landed, and the aircraft was smartly recovered from the sea and disassembled. Tagami now set a course to take the I-25 back down the west coast of Tasmania on the surface. His next target for investigation was the port city of Hobart. On Tasmania's east coast, close to the enormous island's waist, is located Great Oyster Bay, over 20 miles long and 7 miles wide. Surrounded by impressive red granite cliffs and steep headlands, Commander Tagami decided to use this natural cover as the base from which to launch Fujita and Okuda on their third Australian sortie. The I-25 slipped unnoticed into the moonlit bay on the 1st of March, and such was the seclusion offered by the location that Fujita requested that the floatplane be lowered into the water by crane, instead of the more usual high-speed ejection along the I-25's compressed air deck catapult. On a calm sea, the little floatplane taxied clear of the submarine, and after a short run through the waves, lifted clear into the sky, trailing a great cloud of water spray draining from the surface of the floats as Fujita headed south towards Hobart. After a while, he banked to the northwest and circled around the Tasman Peninsula, completing a final turn to approach Hobart from the south. Moonlight made ground identification relatively simple for Okuda, who spied only 5 merchant ships in Hobart's harbour, with no sign of any warships. Fujita made one pass and then turned about and retraced his route in to rendezvous with the I-25. When Fujita landed, early morning light had appeared, and the crew were anxious to recover the plane and get on their way. Suddenly, the XO, Lieutenant Tsukudo, up on the conning tower, let out an exclamation and pointed to the south. A small freighter was lumbering her way along, and for a few moments all eyes turned to the distant vessel, followed by anxious moments as the submarine's crane was winched out over the floatplane and the aircraft attached and made ready for winching aboard. The sea was becoming rougher, and as the crane took up the slack and the aircraft began to lift clear of the water, the action of the waves on the floats caused Fujita's aircraft to pendulum backwards and forwards. With a nasty crunch, a wooden wingtip connected with the crane arm. It was possibly a mission-ending accident, for the I-25 was unable to carry large spares such as aircraft wings. However, over the next 4 days, as the I-25 made her way to New Zealand, the aircraft mechanics managed to patch the plane up sufficiently for Fujita to be able to take to the skies again, although Fujita voiced doubts about the plane's airworthiness nonetheless. On the 8th of March, Fujita and Okuda flew over Wellington, and this time the I-25 herself courted disaster. Spotted by 2 Royal New Zealand Navy anti-submarine patrol boats, the Japanese submarine was slightly damaged during the subsequent depth charging she received. On the 12th, Fujita took to the skies above Auckland, and then Tagami moved on to the British colony of Fiji. His target was the port of Suva, and on the 19th of March, Fujita made a pass over the base, Okuda noting a British cruiser moored below them, before a searchlight illuminated their aircraft. Okuda thought fast, and grasping a signal light, he flashed a meaningless Morse code message at the searchlight crew, who obligingly responded by switching their light off when confronted by what they evidently perceived to be a friendly aircraft. By the 23rd of March, the Yokosuka floatplane was in need of proper repairs, for when Tagami ordered Fujita aloft for a reconnaissance of Pago Pago, the floatplane's engine refused to start. In the end, Tagami had to resort to an inadequate periscope sweep of the island before heading for the Japanese naval base at Truk for fuel and provisions. The I-25 then left for Japan in a refit and overhaul at the Yokosuka Naval Base south of Tokyo. Tune in next time for the Japanese midget submarine attack on Sydney. In Target Australia, Japanese submarine attacks on Sydney and Newcastle. This episode was written and narrated by Dr. Mark Felton. For a wide variety of military history videos, visit my other YouTube channel, Mark Felton Productions. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon. Details in the description box below.